Chapter 33-32, Chapter 406, Failed Sanctuary. Chapter 33-32, Chapter 406, Failed Sanctuary. Chapter 406, Failed Sanctuary. World Passage, Void Sea. This is a space-time storm? When Shifeng opened his eyes, he was shocked to find that the world passage had disappeared, and taking its place was a dark void with a silver vortex the size of a star. Although he had long guessed that a problem had occurred inside the world passage when he heard that the world gate on the greater god's domain side had disappeared, he still couldn't believe his eyes when he saw that the world passage was no more, and a space-time storm had taken its place. Space-time storms were incredibly dangerous in God's domain, and they were labeled as forbidden lands by players. Space-time storms were not products of nature. Instead, they were artificially created, and they were typically used as a last resort to seal dangerous ancient gods. Shifeng did not doubt even for a second that the white-robed ancient god was responsible for creating the space-time storm before him. How ruthless! Shifeng was at a loss for words as he looked at the growing silver vortex. The formation of a space-time storm required an unimaginable amount of mana. Even an ancient god would have to risk their lives to create one. After all, it was one of the few methods that could be used against ancient gods. In other words, the white-robed ancient god was willing to risk their life to deal with Shifeng. Unfortunately, despite knowing what he was dealing with, there was nothing Shifeng could do about it. The gravitational pull of a space-time storm was so powerful that not even Tier 6 gods could resist it, let alone a measly Tier 4 sword emperor like himself. Subsequently, amidst Shifeng's exasperation, his body transformed into a streak of light as he got sucked into the space-time storm. Upon entering the space-time storm, Shifeng fell into a trance. While in this trance, he couldn't tell from left and right or up and down. He couldn't even tell the passage of time. He only knew that he was continuously advancing through space, passing through one god's domain after another. At a certain point, he even started to travel across realms. After an unknown amount of time, Shifeng felt as if he had collided with something, which caused him to tumble off course. When Shifeng snapped out of his trance and opened his eyes, he found himself lying amidst an abandoned city situated in the void. What a powerful mana suppression! When Shifeng tried to get up, he suddenly found that he couldn't release his mana out of his body. On the contrary, the surrounding mana was continuously trying to squeeze into his body. Before Shifeng could figure out what was going on, a series of system notifications entered his ears. System warning, you have discovered the fallen Holy Realm. System warning, you cannot go offline while in the Holy Realm. Should you forcibly go offline, you will be at high risk of falling into a permanent comatose state. System warning, you cannot communicate with the outside world while inside the Holy Realm. The content of the system warnings stunned Shifeng. The Holy Realm? Shifeng had only ever seen the Holy Realm being mentioned in the records kept in the Greater God's Domain's Great Titan Library. Back then, most Tier 6 powerhouses felt that the Holy Realm's existence was nothing but a fairy tale and it didn't actually exist. According to the Great Titan Library's records, the Holy Realm was the failed product of a certain kingdom. The kingdom in question had ruled over an entire realm, and it had aspired to transform its realm into a sanctuary so that it could reside in the central area of the greater god's domain and gain power beyond the ancient gods. Although the kingdom ultimately failed to achieve its goal for reasons unknown to others, it managed to detach its realm from other realms. Or, more specifically, the kingdom's realm had become completely independent of the other realms, and the realm came to possess mana far greater than what was available in other realms. From the information described in the Great Titan Library's records, once a person entered the Holy Realm, exiting it was an incredibly challenging task. In exchange, though, one would get to explore the remnants of the kingdom that once ruled over the Holy Realm. It should be known that they were talking about a kingdom that had come very close to creating an artificial sanctuary. The technology left behind by such a kingdom was undoubtedly superior to what was available in the modern era. Even the technological standards of the current sanctuaries might not be a match for that kingdom. Before Shifeng could investigate his situation further, he made a surprising discovery. People. Many people. While wandering the streets of the abandoned city, he came across numerous players combing through the streets of the city. These players moved in parties of 6, and they carefully searched the streets and buildings around them. After spending some time observing these players in secret, Shifeng found that every one of these players were only at level 140, tier 4. However, their equipment standards were through the roof. Each of them was equipped with a minimum of 4 fragmented legendary items. Some were even equipped in fragmented legendary equipment sets. Apart from having excellent weapons and equipment, these players also displayed astonishing combat standards. The weakest among these players was a titled expert, with many of them being experts capable of matching experts the likes of Saint 9. Normally, even the various hegemonic powers would have difficulty coming up with a party of such experts. Yet, parties of such caliber could be seen everywhere in this place. Have you found them yet? A tier 4 ranger, the leader of a party, asked as he looked at tier 4 assassin who had just come out of a house. There's nobody here, the tier 4 assassin said, shaking his head. Still nothing. The tier 4 ranger frowned. Then, he pointed in a certain direction and said, check that side next. We have to find those punks today. Otherwise, boss is going to let us have it. I know that. Revealing a bitter expression, the tier 4 assassin said, I'm really starting to regret entering this place. Instead of toiling here, I could be living a leisurely life outside. Oh, don't say that. The opportunities available outside cannot compare to this place. Any random party dungeon here has a chance of dropping fragmented legendary items and treasures such as god crystals. You can't get these things outside even if you have the money to afford them, the tier 4 ranger said with a yearning look. Also, don't get me started on the eternal stones you can get from 20-man team dungeons. Those things can go for ridiculous prices. Just one eternal stone is enough to exchange for permanent residence in a second-tier city, while 10 can be exchanged for permanent residence in a first-tier city. These are normally opportunities that we can't even dream of getting in the outside world. I guess you're right. After hearing the ranger's words, the assassin also revealed a yearning look. Even though they were 2-star mental strength grandmasters in the greater world, they could only afford to stay in a second-tier city occasionally. Only big shots such as 3-star mental strength grandmasters had the qualifications to stay in a second-tier city long-term. As for the greater world's first-tier cities, those were not places that 2-star mental strength grandmasters like themselves could hope to live in under normal circumstances. Now, though, they had the opportunity to gain permanent residence in a first-tier city so long as they could get their hands on the eternal stones unique to the Holy Realm. Although they had no idea what use eternal stones had, they knew that the various conglomerates were looking to collect them. Moreover, the prices the conglomerates offered were absurdly generous, so they naturally couldn't miss out on such an opportunity. Shortly after the party resumed its search, the tier 4 assassin responsible for scouting suddenly smiled and shouted, "Quick! They're here!" After saying so, the tier 4 assassin swiped the dagger he wielded at the empty space before him, shattering it and revealing the figures of 6 players. Why are they here? When Shifeng saw the 6 revealed figures from his distant hiding spot, he couldn't help but be stunned. This was because out of these 6 people, he recognized 3 of them. Of these 3 people, 2 were men and 1 was a woman. Of the 2 men, one of them was the Purple Melody Alliance's Desolate Fury, while the other was Cross, the Red Star Kingdom's undefeated battle maniac. As for the woman, she was La Roja, the Myriad Forest Empire's Empress Blood Arrow. Meanwhile, after having their locations exposed, these 3 people reacted like frightened rabbits, their expressions turning indescribably ugly. Split up! Cross shouted almost at the same time as his party's location was exposed. Immediately afterward, the 6 exposed players fled in 6 different directions, none of them having any desire to fight the players before them. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3333, Chapter 407, Ninth Absolute Technique. Chapter 3333, Chapter 407, Ninth Absolute Technique. Chapter 407, Ninth Absolute Technique. Was I mistaken? When Shifeng saw Desolate Fury, Cross, and La Roja fleeing without hesitation, he couldn't help but wonder if he had recognized the wrong people. Setting Desolate Fury aside, who were Cross and La Roja? They were living legends. While Cross and La Roja weren't at the level where they were known by all in the Starlight Realm, their names were still more or less known by the Starlight Realm's various powers. Under normal circumstances, Cross and La Roja would dare to fight against even Tier 5 players, let alone Tier 4 players. After all, the two could already rival Tier 5 players in terms of basic attributes. And while they might not have as many absolute techniques as paragons the likes of Storm and Saint Arm, they were likely evenly matched with the Paimon conglomerate's core paragons when it came to combat standards. Yet, now, the two battle maniacs had chosen to flee without putting up a fight. If it weren't for their familiar faces, Shifeng would have assumed he was looking at two completely different people. However, Shifeng quickly denied this possibility. Even if there existed people who shared similar appearances with Desolate Fury, Cross, and La Roja, it was too much of a coincidence for these people to be gathered together. However, before Shifeng could ponder over his three acquaintances' presence in the Holy Realm, Desolate Fury's party of 6 was stopped by the surrounding search parties. When Shifeng saw Desolate Fury, Cross, and La Roja engaging their opponents in battle, he was further reaffirmed that these three people were the same people he was acquainted with. Desolate Fury was known as the Divine Shield Bearer during Shifeng's previous life. Although Desolate Fury wasn't currently wielding a divine shield, his way around the shield was top-notch. When he focused solely on defending himself, he perfectly neutralized the attacks of the three berserkers besieging him. Cross and La Roja performed even more outstandingly than Desolate Fury. Each of them took on an entire party of 6 by themselves. If not for their opponents employing a battle array, which boosted their basic attributes and linked their 5 senses, it would have been only a matter of time before Cross and La Roja had defeated their opponents. As for the 3 remaining members of Desolate Fury's party, they were also powerful experts. Unfortunately, as they weren't as strong as Cross and La Roja, and neither were they MTS, they got killed by the parties they fought after only a few exchanges. Damn it. Nothing. Fuck. These bastards are wasting our time. The 3 parties responsible for killing the 3 members of Desolate Fury's party cursed when they saw that their kills had only dropped 3 pieces of equipment. Then, they charged at Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury with angry looks. When the 3 other parties saw this, they began attacking Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury with even greater ferocity. Hand that thing over, and we will spare you. Yes. Hand over what you got from the dungeon, and we will guarantee your safety. That's right. You don't want your basic attributes to be permanently reduced, do you? So be good and hand us that thing. While looking at the 3 players struggling desperately to survive, the leaders of the 3 parties started to persuade them with words. It was obvious that they did not wish to share whatever they were looking for with the other parties. Do you take us for fools? La Roja rolled her eyes in disgust at the party leaders trying to persuade them. The day your words can be trusted will be when pigs fly. Their party had long discerned the personalities of the people targeting them. Every one of these bastards was a ruthless person. Previously, several other parties had handed over their harvest to these ruthless bastards after being promised safety. In the end, all of these parties were slaughtered without exception. Your mouth really doesn't match that pretty face of yours, the Tier 4 ranger leading the party attacking La Roja said. Unfortunately, even though you've guessed correctly, you don't get a prize for it. If you want to blame someone, blame whoever sent you from the Starlight Realm. Since they only sent a bunch of weaklings here, we naturally have to eliminate you first. Do you think you can kill us? Aren't you getting a little too confident? Cross said, laughing. Immediately afterward, he activated a berserk skill and sent 2 of his opponents flying, breaking out of the encirclement in the blink of an eye. In no time, Cross had put over 200 yards between himself and the party of 6 targeting him. However, just when he thought he had left the party of 6 attack range, a rain of swords suddenly fell on him. Boom, boom, boom. A series of explosions rang across the street as the swords rained down on Cross. When the rain of swords ended and the dust settled, Cross's originally unscathed body became covered in cuts and blood. His HP also plummeted to a critical level. You useless pieces of trash. I only had you chase after a bunch of weaklings, yet you nearly let one of them get away. A cold, berating voice suddenly came from over 1,000 yards away, causing the players besieging Desolate Fury's party to shrink their necks and break out in cold sweat. This is Cross turned to look at the skinny figure approaching him from a distance, his eyes full of disbelief. The ninth absolute technique, Star Rain? It seems you're quite knowledgeable, the skinny figure said, feeling a little surprised as he looked at Cross. Unfortunately, as you and your friends are trash from the Starlight Realm, none of you will leave this place alive. The same goes for you, you eavesdropping punk over there. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33-34, Chapter 408, Zero Wings Black Flame? Chapter 33-34, Chapter 408, Zero Wings Black Flame? Chapter 408, Zero Wings Black Flame? As soon as the skinny swordsman finished speaking, he suddenly flicked his thorn-like long sword. Before Cross could react, countless streaks of light struck a 3-story building over 1,000 yards away, reducing it into rubble in the blink of an eye. So fast. Desolate Fury, who was desperately defending himself from his attackers, gasped when he saw the attack the skinny swordsman had just executed. The skinny swordsman's attack was fast in not only projectile speed but also attack frequency. The skinny swordsman had launched so many attacks at a time that it was simply impossible for Tier 4 players to react to all of them. Even with 2 shields in hand, Desolate Fury did not think he could perfectly defend himself against all those attacks. "It's your turn next," the skinny swordsman said as he looked at Cross's blooded figure, his voice filled with contempt. However, before the skinny swordsman could brandish his thorn-like long sword, a crimson streak of light suddenly appeared behind him. "Boss!" The players attacking Desolate Fury's group panicked. The attack had appeared silently and suddenly, and it did not cause any fluctuations in space. They wouldn't have even sensed its existence if they hadn't seen the crimson streak of light. Amazing. When Cross saw the crimson streak of light, even he couldn't help but be awed by it. The crimson streak of light was a crimson arrow launched by LaRoja. The attack's name was Blood Arrow, and it was what had earned LaRoja the title of Empress Blood Arrow. None of the opponents she had used this attack against thus far had managed to defend against it. Seeing the attack now, Cross had to tip his hat to LaRoja. If he were on the receiving end of LaRoja's Blood Arrow, he highly doubted he could block it, even if he was mentally prepared for it. You dare to launch a sneak attack with such low standards? While everyone's attention was concentrated on LaRoja's attack, a cold voice entered their ears. Upon hearing this voice, both LaRoja and Cross felt their hearts shuddering. The skinny swordsman was unscathed. Contrary to what everyone thought, LaRoja's blood arrow did not hit the skinny swordsman. Instead, it had harmlessly passed through the swordsman, utterly failing to hit the swordsman's actual body. "You're a 5th floor expert." LaRoja looked at the sneering swordsman in disbelief. A 5th floor expert. This was the only possibility LaRoja could think of to explain how the skinny swordsman had managed to evade her attack with no warning whatsoever. "Why would an expert like you appear here?" Cross similarly realized what had just happened, despair filling his eyes as he looked at the skinny swordsman. After reaching the 5th floor standard, experts could already consistently predict threats toward them. Unless there was a significant gap in basic attributes, any attacks launched by a non-5th floor expert against a 5th floor expert would be useless. Under the same tier, a 5th floor expert could defeat non-5th floor experts in a one-on-one situation without taking a single point of damage. However, this was a 5th floor expert they were talking about. There were hardly any Tier 6 experts at this standard in the Starlight Realm, let alone Tier 4 experts. So, Cross found it flabbergasting that he would meet a 5th floor expert in this place. What? Falling into despair already? The contempt in the skinny swordsman's eyes grew when he saw that Cross's will to fight had disappeared. "Serves you right for not letting us kill you sooner. Now, you people will get a taste of despair. That's why I say that people from the Starlight Realm are trash. Even though you know you aren't a match for us, you still insist on resisting. In the end, all you managed to do was make a fool of yourselves. I'm really starting to wonder what has gotten into the 7 Luminaries Alliance. Why would the Alliance put someone who had merely defeated 2 pieces of trash onto the Luminous Glory list? Some shady dealings must be going on behind the scenes. I'm guessing that the Seven Luminaries Alliance must have lowered its standards out of consideration for the Starlight Realms players growing weaker and weaker with every passing generation. Otherwise, nobody from the Starlight Realms' current generation can get onto any of the Seven Luminaries lists. That might very well be the case. Ever since the Madwoman's generation, the Starlight Realm has not produced even one capable fighter until now. When the surrounding players saw the despair on Cross's and LaRoge's faces, they started snickering and talking among themselves. According to insider information, their leader, Ghost Hand the Starsword, was originally slated to debut on the Luminous Glory list in the ranking list's latest revision. However, because of the sudden appearance of a player named Black Flame, Ghost Hand was pushed to the 1001st rank and deprived of his debut on the Luminous Glory list. This turn of events had infuriated Ghost Hand, and he vowed to kill any Starlight Realm player he came across. "Die, you pieces of trash from the Starlight Realm," Ghost Hand shouted as he raised his long sword to execute another star rain. "It's over." LaRoge sighed when she saw that Ghost Hand was about to launch another attack. The gap between 4th and 5th floor experts was simply too massive. Out of all the Starlight Realm players who had entered the Holy Realm, only the top few players could hope to match Ghost Hand. Everyone else could, at most, survive 2 moves against him. However, just as Ghost Hand was about to attack with his thorn-like long sword, a deep voice suddenly came from afar. Although the voice was soft, the words spoken by this voice loudly echoed in everyone's minds. "You dare to launch a sneak attack with such low standards?" Every word spoken by this voice was the same as what Ghost Hand had previously said. Even the tone used by this voice was the same contemptuous tone Ghost Hand had previously used. "Who's there?" Ghost Hand snapped his head toward the source of the voice and executed Star Rain in that direction without hesitation. Immediately, countless swords rained down on the remnants of the 3-story building that Ghost Hand had previously demolished. This time, the sword rain had lasted for a full 3 seconds before stopping. It was obvious that Ghost Hand was incensed by the provocation and had no intentions of holding back. However, just when everyone thought it was over, they saw a person walking out of the dust and debris. Moreover, to their surprise, this person had seemingly come out of Ghost Hand's attack unscathed as he walked steadily and leisurely. "Who are you?" Ghost Hand couldn't help himself from asking as he looked at the person walking out of the settling dust. Star Rain was Ghost Hand's trademark move. It was also the combat technique he was most proud of. With the aid of this combat technique, rarely would he come across a worthy opponent among those of the same generation. Although some experts could block his Star Rain, they'd usually end up battered and nearly dead like Cross after doing so. Out of all the opponents Ghost Hand had fought thus far, the only ones who had managed to come out of his Star Rain unscathed were old monsters. However, based on the appearance and voice of the person in front of him, it was obvious the other party was a young man. "Who am I?" The figure amidst the dust chuckled. "Someone who's stronger than you." "You." Ghost Hand flew into a rage when he heard the other party's words. Just when Ghost Hand was about to execute another attack, the dust finally settled, revealing the figure it previously shrouded. Meanwhile, upon seeing this figure, whether it was Ghost Hand, Cross, LaRoge, or Desolate Fury, all of them couldn't help but widen their eyes in shock. "Black Flame? You're Black Flame? The Azura Sword Emperor? How are you here, Brother Black Flame? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible." Chapter 33-35, Chapter 409, Exclusive Absolute Technique. Chapter 33-35, Chapter 409, Exclusive Absolute Technique. Chapter 409, Exclusive Absolute Technique. Cross, LaRoge, and Desolate Fury were very familiar with the appearance of the player named Black Flame. It was especially so for Desolate Fury. When Desolate Fury again saw the inconspicuous yet familiar person, feelings of surprise and melancholy filled his heart. When they first met in the Ancient River Kingdom's rookie competition, Desolate Fury's first impression of the player named Black Flame was that the other party was insane. After all, only a lunatic would dare to provoke Saint 3, who happened to be the pinnacle of Tier 4 players in the Ancient River Kingdom at the time. However, contrary to Desolate Fury's expectations, Black Flame had not only made it into the rookie competition's finals, but he had even proceeded to become the rookie competition's champion. As a result, not only did Black Flame's fame instantly overshadow Saint 3, but he was even granted the title of the Ancient River Kingdom's first paragon, a title that hadn't been granted to anyone for the past several decades. Later on, Desolate Fury heard that Black Flame had ended up offending the Paimon conglomerate's young master Dira and incensed the Divine Seal Saint into sending an army after him. Yet, just when Desolate Fury and everyone else in the Ancient River Kingdom thought that Black Flame was doomed, Black Flame became an expert on the Luminous Glory list after a stunning battle in the World Passage. A Luminous Glory list expert. This was a dazzling glory that even Saint 3 could only look up at in awe. Meanwhile, when Cross and La Roja saw Black Flame appearing before them, mixed feelings filled their hearts. Initially, even after Black Flame became the champion of the Ancient River Kingdom's rookie competition, neither Cross nor La Roja felt they were inferior to him. At most, they thought of him as a strong competitor. After all, the rookie competition's finals at the time didn't involve a direct duel between the top 10 finalists. It was more so a test to see who had the better equipment standard. Hence, nobody could say for certain who would win in an actual duel. Not to mention, their goal was never to become the rookie competition's champion. Instead, their goal was to qualify for the official phase of the Galaxy Conglomerate's invitational competition. Only, neither Cross nor La Roja had expected Black Flame to become an expert on the Luminous Glory list in the short time they hadn't seen him. His Black Flame, the Azura Sword Emperor. So, is that Azura Sword Emperor? When the other players present saw Shafong walking closer and closer to them, they promptly ceased their offensive on Desolate Fury's group and looked at Shafong warily. The Luminous Glory list was a compilation of the Greater Gods Domain's top 1,000 Tier 4 experts under the age of 35. Every individual on the list stood at the pinnacle of Tier 4 in the Greater Gods Domain. Even someone at the bottom of the Luminous Glory list was overwhelmingly stronger than titled experts. So, you're Black Flame? Ghost Hand wasn't all too surprised when he saw Shafong coming out of his attack unscathed. On the contrary, he smiled at this sight. I thought I would never get my revenge on you. I never thought I would actually meet you here. Now, I'm going to let those fools over at the Seven Luminaries Alliance know how unreliable their ranking lists are. The latest edition of the Luminous Glory list was originally supposed to be the stepping stone for Ghost Hand to propel himself to the apex of his realm. However, he had lost this opportunity because the Seven Luminaries Alliance made the laughable decision to put Shafong on the 963rd rank of the Luminous Glory list after Shafong defeated 2 paragons from the Paimon conglomerate. From Ghost Hand's perspective, whether it was the Paimon conglomerate Storm or Saint Arm, both were trash. This was because neither of them was even at the pseudo-5th floor standard. If it were up to him, he could have handily defeated 6 of such experts simultaneously, let alone 2. So, on what basis did Shafong deserve to get ranked 963rd on the Luminous Glory list? After Ghost Hand finished speaking, he suddenly vanished from everyone's vision. Be careful. He's not a swordsman. La Roja shouted when she saw Ghost Hand disappearing. This was a discovery she had made only recently. More specifically, it was after Ghost Hand had evaded her ultimate move, Blood Arrow. Unlike Cross, she could tell that Ghost Hand didn't rely on only his sixth sense to evade her attack. Instead, he had paired his sixth sense with a skill. He's not a swordsman. Cross was stunned by La Roja's revelation. Out of the 99 absolute techniques in the Greater Gods Domain, the 9th-ranked Star Rain was a type of swordsmanship. So, to say that Ghost Hand wasn't a swordsman was absurd. Not bad, pretty lady. You actually guessed that Boss Ghost isn't a swordsman. It's a pity that your warning is too late. Now that Black Flame has let Boss Ghost get within 100 yards of him, he's as good as dead. Ghost Hand's subordinates were quite surprised by La Roja's statement. At the same time, though, they couldn't help but laugh. Indeed, Ghost Hand wasn't a swordsman but an assassin instead. It was just that normally when fighting, Ghost Hand didn't even need to go into stealth. Star Rain was enough for him to take care of most of his opponents. Moreover, Ghost Hand preferred to use a one-handed longsword, which gave others the false impression that he was a swordsman. After all, Many skills for assassins required the use of a dagger or a short sword. Not to mention, similar to how most high-ranking longswords would provide bonuses to swordsman skills, many high-ranking daggers and short swords would provide bonuses for assassin skills. So, it didn't make sense for an assassin to be using a long sword. However, the long sword Ghost Hand used was different. Magic weapon, Thorn of Sins. This was a long sword that provided bonuses for the assassin class. Moreover, rather than a long sword, it'd be more accurate to consider it a weapon made up of numerous sharp blades. It could be used to launch numerous sharp projectiles or wielded like a whip or a normal longsword. This allowed Ghost Hand to attack his opponents using various combat styles, making him incredibly unpredictable. Of course, compared to his weapon, Ghost Hand himself was a much greater threat. Once Ghost Hand entered stealth, even experts who had mastered their sixth sense could not perceive his presence. Paired with the Thorn of Sins, Ghost Hand could kill any opponent within 100 yards of him with almost 100% certainty. While Ghost Hand's subordinates were talking among themselves, Shifeng unsheathed the Winter of Eternal Night, not daring to be careless. Experts who had reached the 5th floor standard were existences standing at the apex of the greater god's domain. Every one of these experts had their own specialty that they could use to integrate their sixth sense with skills, spells, or combat techniques, and by doing so, they could create absolute techniques exclusive to themselves. Meanwhile, even 5th floor experts would be at risk of instant death if they weren't careful when going up against another 5th floor expert's exclusive absolute technique. To make matters worse, Shifeng had never heard of Ghost Hand's name during his previous life. Among 5th floor experts, the ones whose names had never been heard were usually regarded as the most dangerous. This was because, unlike well-known 5th floor experts who had been thoroughly analyzed by others, nobody knew what kind of exclusive absolute techniques these unknown 5th floor experts could have up their sleeves. Hence, Shifeng needed to be very cautious when fighting against the assassin. You should feel honored. You will be the first person I use this next move on. While Ghost Hand looked at Shifeng from stealth, the Thorn of Sins in his hand transformed into countless invisible petals that silently danced around Shifeng. Exclusive absolute technique, Omni Rain. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33-36, Chapter 410, Divine Might. Chapter 33-36, Chapter 410, Divine Might. Chapter 410, Divine Might. The scene that took place following Ghost Hand's disappearance left everyone shocked. In the blink of an eye, the buildings lining the dilapidated street had become riddled with holes. Then, a moment later, these buildings were reduced to dust and scattered in the wind. However, rather than the level of destruction Ghost Hand caused, what terrified everyone, even more, was the fact that they couldn't perceive any of his attacks. It was to a point where their minds failed to sense any danger despite witnessing the destruction that had just taken place. Is this the true strength of a 5th floor expert? Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury were stupefied when they saw the weathering phenomenon before them. All three of them were experts who had experienced many great battles in the greater god's domain. However, whether they were going up against ferocious monsters or experts with long-standing fame, they could always more or less perceive danger when clashing with their opponents. Some of these opponents could even instill fear into them. Meanwhile, any experienced expert would know that the sense of danger and fear one felt was the mind's self-protection mechanism doing its job to make one aware that someone or something was a threat to their life. However, even though the weathering phenomenon before them was clearly a grave threat to them, their minds failed to show any reactions to it. It was as if they were currently witnessing a normal event, such as the sun rising from the east, and their minds didn't think it was necessary to give them any warnings. Realizing this, Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury felt their scalps going numb. In the greater god's domain, battles between Tier 4 experts and above usually occur at speeds that the naked eye could not keep up with. As a result, experts at Tier 4 and above would need to rely on their body's other senses to form an instinctive coping mechanism against them. Only by doing so could they keep up with high-speed battles that were too fast for the naked eye to follow. However, if none of their senses could perceive anything, just thinking about the consequences terrified them. This would be no different from an opponent having already run a sword through their hearts while they were still under the assumption that the opponent had yet to make a move. How were they supposed to fight against such an opponent? Subsequently, the weathering phenomenon could be seen converging on Shifeng's location. However, even though they could see the dilapidated street disintegrating, they still couldn't perceive what was causing it. What a powerful exclusive absolute technique. He is indeed brilliant to be able to modify star rain to such an extent. Shifeng couldn't help but admire Ghost Hand as he looked at the disintegrating street and buildings around him. The ninth absolute technique, Star Rain, was a combat technique that utilized an extraordinarily high attack frequency to overwhelm the opponent's nervous response system. Meanwhile, Ghost Hand improved this technique by making all of his attacks invisible. Or, more accurately, impossible for others to perceive. Ghost Hand's attacks were not only visually undetectable, they also could not be detected by any of the body's other senses. Without having mastered Star Rain to an incredible degree, it would be impossible to manipulate Star Rain to such an extent. Meanwhile, when going against such an exclusive absolute technique, even experts ranked at the bottom of the luminous glory list would be killed instantly without adequate countermeasures. It's a pity this move is useless against me. Shifeng grinned as he raised the Winter of Eternal Night. World of Frost. 9 frost swords could be seen flying to a distant building that was over 10 stories tall. Immediately afterward, the sound of metal clashing came from the building. Then, Ghost Hand could be seen flying out of the building with the Thorn of Sins returning to its original longsword appearance in his hand. The spectators present fell into silence upon seeing this. This development especially dumbfounded Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury. You saw through my technique. Ghost Hand was in disbelief as he looked at Shifeng's distant figure. Ghost Hand was confident nobody could perceive him while he was under stealth, much less see through his exclusive absolute technique. After all, he had previously relied on the combination of these two things to kill a 5th-floor expert and qualify for the Luminous Glory list. Yet, even though Shifeng clearly wasn't a 5th-floor expert, Shifeng had not only seen through his technique but also pinpointed his location. It's nothing to be surprised about, Shifeng said as he looked at Ghost Hand. Your technique might be powerful, but it also has obvious flaws. Star Rain prides itself in having a high attack frequency. If you want to erase the presence of all those attacks, you will have to invest a lot of time and energy into the endeavor. That means you will likely be stationary and susceptible to attacks while executing your technique. In that case, so long as I can find your location and attack you, you'll have no choice but to stop your technique. Ghost Hand did not refute Shifeng's words. This was because he had a very clear understanding of his exclusive absolute technique, Omni Rain, and that included its weaknesses. However, while Shifeng's explanation of how he disrupted his technique might sound simple, finding him while he was under stealth was not a simple task. In fact, it should be impossible for a 4th-floor expert like Shifeng. For 4th-floor experts, the only reliable way to disrupt him while he was executing Omni Rain was by bombarding the area with large-scale destruction spells. Yet, Shifeng spoke as if he knew his whereabouts. Actually, that had to be the case since Shifeng had accurately launched attacks at him. This was simply unbelievable. Although I don't know how you managed to locate my presence, it doesn't change the fact that you still aren't a 5th-floor expert. After taking a deep breath, Ghost Hand looked at Shifeng with a sneer. If Omni Rain doesn't work against you, what about the actual Star Rain? How many times will you be able to block it? After saying so, Ghost Hand began brandishing the Thorn of Sins and sending numerous sword lights raining down on Shifeng from all directions. 1 second. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. Unlike when Ghost Hand executed Star Rain against Cross, he did not stop executing the technique against Shifeng after only a brief moment. Instead, he executed it continuously and bombarded Shifeng's location with a constant stream of sword lights. If players had yet to reach the 5th-floor standard, they would be incapable of maximizing the potential of their 6th sense to predict danger. Without this ability, players would be incapable of coping against an overwhelming number of attacks. Even if players relied on skills and spells to defend themselves, these would only be temporary measures that would run out sooner or later. After Ghost Hand continued his assault for 2 whole minutes, the area Shifeng stood in had transformed into a huge crater littered with countless small holes. From the devastation Ghost Hand caused, one could see just how frighteningly high his attack frequency was. However, executing Star Rain continuously for 2 whole minutes did not come without a price. At this time, Ghost Hand's complexion had become extremely pale, and his hand that wielded the Thorn of Sins was trembling. Evidently, Ghost Hand had pushed himself to the limits in his attack on Shifeng. "It's over," Ghost Hand said indifferently as he looked into the empty crater, unsurprised that it was empty. Then, he turned his gaze to Desolate Fury's group of 3 and continued, "It's your turn next." However, as soon as Ghost Hand finished speaking, he immediately sensed something was amiss. This was because he could not see the fearful expressions he had expected to find on Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury. Instead, all he saw were expressions of confusion. "Boss, be careful. He's behind you," Ghost Hand's subordinates shouted in a panic. "Behind?" Before he realized it, a long sword had pierced through his heart. His HP had even instantly plummeted to 0. Ghost Hand instinctively tried to activate a life-saving skill when he heard his subordinates' warnings. However, before he could do so, he felt a pain in his chest. Then, when he looked down, he found that a long sword had pierced his heart and deprived him of all of his HP. When Ghost Hand turned around to look behind him, he couldn't help but reveal a bewildered expression. This was because he found Shifeng standing behind him completely unscathed. Not even a single point was missing from Shifeng's HP bar. However, what Ghost Hand found even more astonishing was that Shifeng had gotten behind him without alerting his danger senses. Then, just as he was wondering why his danger senses had failed him, he suddenly noticed that the feeling of insecurity he had experienced and was still experiencing after stepping into this region had suddenly disappeared. "This is divine might." Ghost Hand immediately understood why he had failed to perceive any danger from Shifeng's attack. Divine might. The moment he had stepped into this region, he was already under the influence of Shifeng's divine might. Everywhere within a person's divine might was a danger zone for hostile targets. So, how was his mind supposed to convey that danger was approaching if it had already been continuously doing so since long ago? Unfortunately, Ghost Hand realized this point too late, as his HP had already fallen to 0, and his vision had started to go dark. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33-37, Chapter 411, Eternal Stone. Chapter 33-37, Chapter 411, Eternal Stone. Chapter 411, Eternal Stone. Boss? Ghost Hand's subordinates fell into a daze when they saw him collapse. In addition to being one of the few 5th-floor experts among the Dragon Mountain Realm's younger generation, Ghost Hand was one of the few budding experts who could hold his ground against older generation 5th-floor experts. Yet, now, Ghost Hand was killed by Shifeng in one move? At this time, even Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury were dumbfounded by this situation. Although the 3 of them had long expected Shifeng to have extraordinary strength after he got into the Luminous Glory list, they didn't think he would be this strong. Just a second ago, they thought that Shifeng had died under Ghost Hand's Star Rain. Yet, in the next second, Ghost Hand was killed by Shifeng. They also clearly saw that Ghost Hand had failed to sense Shifeng's presence behind him right until Shifeng stabbed him. Is there really such a massive gap between a Luminous Glory expert and a non-Luminous Glory expert? La Roja dared not believe her eyes when she saw Ghost Hand's corpse falling to the ground. Although it had been many years since the Starlight Realm had produced a Luminous Glory expert, that did not stop her from researching the experts on the Luminous Glory list. Meanwhile, from the information she studied, while she acknowledged that the Luminous Glory list's experts were inhuman, were they strong to such an exaggerated extent? It should be known that Ghost Hand was already a 5th-floor expert. Killing 4th-floor experts like them should be child's play for him. It also wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was already equal to the experts on the Luminous Glory list. Yet, Ghost Hand couldn't even last more than one move against Shifeng. Different from La Roja, Cross broke out into cold sweat when he saw Shifeng handily defeating Ghost Hand. After all, Before the rookie competition's final started, he had boldly stated that Shifeng might be able to become a worthy opponent for him in the future. He was basically treating Shifeng like a junior at the time. Thank goodness the rookie competition's finals didn't adopt a dual format. Otherwise, I'd have made a huge fool out of myself, Cross thought as he wiped the sweat on his forehead. If he were to stand in Ghost Hand's shoes, he probably wouldn't even know how he had died to Shifeng. As for Desolate Fury, he couldn't help but let out a rueful sigh when he saw Shifeng defeating Ghost Hand. When they first met, Shifeng was a nobody whom even Lightning Chaser looked at in contempt. Now, Shifeng had already reached a height where he couldn't even see. With the strength to slay a fifth-floor expert in one move, there was no doubt that Shifeng had already reached the apex of the Starlight Realm's younger generation of Tier 4 experts. At this point, only older generation Tier 4 experts would have any hope of one-upping him. While Desolate Fury was immersed in melancholy, the Dragon Mountain Realms players briefly looked at each other before scattering without hesitation, none of them daring to continue their assault on Desolate Fury's group. If all of them were to fight against Ghost Hand together, it would only be a matter of time before Ghost Hand killed them all. Now that it was proven that even Ghost Hand wasn't a match for Shifeng, even if Shifeng wasn't an assassin, so long as he could kill one of them with every swing of his sword, it wouldn't take him more than 100 swings to end the fight. The penalty for death in the Holy Realm was incredibly severe. Should players die, they would permanently lose 10% of their basic attributes. If they died too many times, their accounts would be essentially crippled. In no time, the Dragon Mountain Realms players vanished from the area. They're finally gone. Shifeng sighed in relief when he saw the Dragon Mountain Realms players retreating. The mana suppression in the Holy Realm was so powerful that it had thoroughly negated any advantages his mana body had previously provided him. In addition, it became extremely taxing on his concentration and stamina to use combat techniques. Meanwhile, although Divine Might was powerful, it wasn't omnipotent. It only allowed him to perceive his opponent's every movement and mental state as well as suppress his opponent's mental state and 5 senses. For these reasons, Ghost Hand was no different than a titled expert before him. At most, Ghost Hand would possess stronger combat techniques than the average titled expert. However, when going up against several dozen players who were in a battle array that increased their basic attributes and shared linked 5 senses, the advantages provided by Divine Might would diminish. If the Dragon Mountain Realms players were intent on killing him at all costs, it would only be a matter of time before they succeeded. Subsequently, Shifeng picked up a tattered sack that Ghost Hand dropped. Sure enough, he had a substitution tool, Shifeng thought, not feeling too surprised as he looked at the tattered sack. Every peerless paragon belonging to a major power would typically have a substitution tool that could let them negate the penalties of death. This was so that these peerless paragons could avoid accidentally falling into ruin. For a fifth-floor expert like Ghost Hand, it wouldn't even be strange if he had 2 or 3 substitution tools. Meanwhile, if a player with a substitution tool was killed, they wouldn't drop any weapons or equipment. At most, they would lose items guaranteed to drop on death. After collecting Ghost Hand's loot, Shifeng made his way to Desolate Fury's group of 3. "Are you 3 all right?" Shifeng asked when he saw that the 3 people before him were covered in injuries. Then, he continued, "How did you 3 get here? Are you not going to participate in the Galaxy Conglomerate's invitational competition?" Previously, Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury had participated in the Ancient River Kingdom's rookie competition to enter the Galaxy Conglomerate's invitational competition. Now that the competition in question was about to begin, Shifeng found it strange that these 3 people would appear in the Holy Realm. The Galaxy Conglomerate's invitational competition? Looking at Shifeng strangely, Desolate Fury asked, "Don't you know that the competition is already over, Brother Black Flame?" "Over?" Shifeng was confused. Shouldn't it just be starting soon? When he returned to the miniature ancient world from the Greater God's domain, the Galaxy Conglomerate's preliminaries had just begun. Going by how much time had passed, the official phase of the invitational competition shouldn't have started yet, much less ended. It's already been 2 days since the Galaxy Conglomerate's invitational competition has ended, Brother Black Flame, Cross said, affirming Desolate Fury's words. Moreover, We are only here in the Holy Realm because the Galaxy Conglomerate sent us here after the competition. When the competition started, we wondered why you didn't show up. The Galaxy Conglomerate even sent people to try and contact you. The competition ended 2 days ago. When Shifeng heard Cross's words, he suddenly thought of the spacetime storm. He had no idea how much time he had spent in the spacetime storm. The passage of time inside the spacetime storm was also warped, so it wouldn't be strange if a moment in the spacetime storm was several days in the real world. Meanwhile, when Desolate Fury and the others saw Shifeng's reaction, they quickly understood what had happened and started explaining the situation to Shifeng. There were countless mysteries in God's domain. Situations such as players entering an area with a different flow rate of time weren't unheard of. There were even instances of players experiencing 1 year in just 1 day, so Shifeng's case of experiencing one moment in several days wasn't all too surprising. Meanwhile, after listening to the trio's explanation, Shifeng learned that he had spent real-world days in the spacetime storm. He also learned that 2 days ago, the Galaxy Conglomerate had made an astronomical offer to the Tier 4 players of its invitational competition for them to enter the Holy Realm. Originally, everyone who had received the Galaxy Conglomerate's offer was very excited. However, shortly after arriving in the Holy Realm, everyone realized that the Holy Realm wasn't as simple as they thought it to be and that they weren't alone in the Holy Realm. The geniuses and paragons of many other realms had also entered the Holy Realm. Meanwhile, everyone only had one goal in the Holy Realm: the Eternal Stones. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33-38, Chapter 412, Saint Camp. Chapter 33-38, Chapter 412, Saint Camp. Chapter 412, Saint Camp. Eternal Stones? After listening to what the three said, Shifeng recalled the eternity set he had heard about during his previous life. Divine sets might not be overflowing in God's domain, but quite a few still existed throughout God's domain's history. All divine sets possessed incomparable power, and even most of the naturally occurring godly relics could not hold a candle to them. Upon donning a divine set, players could instantly become one of the overlords of God's domain. Out of all the divine sets in existence, 6 of them stood out from the rest, and these 6 sets were labeled as the 6 great divine sets. Meanwhile, the Eternity set was one of these 6 special sets. Few records were available on Eternity, even in the Greater God's Domain's Great Titan Library. According to legends, the last owner of Eternity had relied on the divine set to fight against the myriad ancient gods as a mortal and create an immortal empire during the era of ancient gods. Eventually, the ancient gods acknowledged Eternity's wearer and labeled him the slayer of ancient gods. Later on, though, Eternity's wearer died for some inexplicable reason, and the Eternity set disappeared along with his death. It was also rumored that the Eternity set was destroyed, and its fragments scattered across the various realms. During his previous life, Shifeng heard that the Galaxy Conglomerate had gotten its hands on clues pertaining to the Eternity set. When he combined the fact that the Galaxy Conglomerate was currently making an astronomical offer for the Starlight Realms players to collect Eternal Stones for it, he couldn't help but suspect that the Eternal Stones had something to do with the Eternity set. Or, more specifically, the Eternal Stones were the Eternity set's fragments. "I've already given up on getting Eternal Stones," Cross said with a wry smile. Setting aside the fact that they are only dropped in 20-man God Mode team dungeons, just surviving in the Holy Realm is tough enough. "Is it difficult to survive here?" Shifeng curiously asked. While he had yet to explore the Holy Realm, the monsters he had come across thus far weren't insurmountably powerful. The only problem he could see making it difficult for players like Cross to survive here would be the experts of other realms. However, for experts like Cross, Laroja, and Desolate Fury, so long as they didn't come across 5th-floor experts like Ghost Hand, it shouldn't be difficult to escape with their lives. "You should know that we can't log out of the game if we are in the Holy Realm, Brother Black Flame. If we forcibly log out, we will be at risk of falling into a coma," Desolate Fury explained. "The Galaxy Conglomerate told us that if we wish to leave the Holy Realm, the only way to do so is to get our hands on an Eternal Stone." "We can only leave after obtaining an Eternal Stone?" Shifeng started to have a mild headache when he heard Desolate Fury's explanation. It was a huge problem for him if he couldn't log out of the game while inside the Holy Realm. After all, he still had many things to take care of in the real world. However, acquiring holy stones evidently wasn't a simple task since a powerful team was needed to raid God Mode team dungeons. "We've given up hope on leaving the Holy Realm," Desolate Fury dejectedly said. "Thankfully, there is a way for us to safely log out of the game, and that is to purchase a return talisman. Each return talisman will give players one chance to go offline. The only problem is the exorbitant pricing of these return talismans. Each talisman costs 100 God Crystal Fragments. God Crystal Fragments are only dropped in dungeons, and the drop rate in party dungeons is terrible. Even after raiding party dungeons for 2 whole days, our party only managed to collect about 24 fragments. After dividing them, each of us received less than a handful. At this rate, who knows how long it'll take us to get 100 fragments. The Holy Realm was indeed a land of opportunities. However, for experts of their caliber, even logging out of the game had become a luxury, let alone getting their hands on any fortuitous opportunities. They also couldn't just give up on obtaining God Crystal Fragments, either. After all, they had responsibilities and families in the real world. To their dismay, they had even come across some people who had been trapped in the Holy Realm for decades. All of these people had thought of starting new accounts. Unfortunately, the main god system did not even give them this opportunity. Instead, the main god system only gave them 2 options. They could continue logging back into their accounts and strive to get their hands on an eternal stone, or they could stop playing God's Domain entirely. God's Domain was the only way for people to develop their mental strength effectively in the real world, so quitting God's Domain was not an option. After all, who wouldn't want to live a longer life? When Shifeng finished listening to Desolate Fury's explanation, he couldn't help but be a little astonished. The importance of God crystals need not be said. Many fragmented legendary items could be repaired and upgraded into legendary items using God crystals. Meanwhile, in the greater God's Domain, 100 God crystal fragments could be used to synthesize 1 God crystal, so one could easily imagine the value of God crystal fragments. Yet, the Holy Realm required players to spend 100 God crystal fragments just to gain one opportunity to go offline. Even a wealthy princeling like Dira would find this price costly. Save the talking for later. We should hurry back to camp first. If the Dragon Mountain Realms players return, none of us should think of escaping, La Roja said. Cross and Desolate Fury nodded in agreement. Ghost Hand was indeed one of the few 5th-floor experts among the Dragon Mountain Realm's younger generation. However, the Dragon Mountain Realm didn't just have younger generation experts in the Holy Realm. Older generation experts from the Dragon Mountain Realm were also here. Every one of those older generation experts had already spent many years in the Holy Realm. The strength and foundation they've built for themselves were far superior to what Ghost Hand possessed. If those older generation experts took action, not even the top 300 experts on the Luminous Glory list could match them, let alone someone ranked at the bottom of the list. Hence, their priority now should be to return to a town. Only after they were inside a town would they be safe. Shifeng naturally didn't have any opinions. He was new to the Holy Realm, so the best course of action to take now would be to find a safe haven and gather information. Afterward, Cross, La Roja, and Desolate Fury led Shifeng on a 5-hour dash before arriving outside a town enveloped by a magic barrier. The town was small, smaller than even a guild town. The buildings in the town also looked simple and crude, with the tallest building not exceeding 6 stories tall. However, despite the town's shabby look, it was one of the safest locations in the entire Holy Realm. According to the trio, the towns found in the Holy Realm were known as Saint Camps. As for why they were called as such, it was because every town was managed by one saint. Indeed, a bona fide saint. Although the saints overseeing these towns were only at Tier 4, because they were existences who had reached the pinnacle in a particular world lore, their strength far exceeded the paragons on the Luminous Glory list. It wasn't far-fetched to say that so long as these saints left the Holy Realm, they would instantly become the center of attention of the greater God's Domain. The only reason these saints chose to remain in the Holy Realm was so that they could get their hands on the Holy Realm's fortuitous opportunities. Moreover, standing behind every one of these saints was a cross-realm conglomerate. So, whether in terms of individual or group strength, these saints were not opponents that the individual player or conglomerate could hope to contend against. The moment Shifeng set foot into the sparsely populated saint camp, he immediately understood what made the Holy Realm extraordinary. Even the weakest player walking on the saint camp streets was a titled expert, and many experts were on Cross's and La Roge's standards. In addition, quite a few of these experts were equipped with legendary weapons and equipment. While walking among these players, Cross, La Roge, and Desolate Fury were far from being conspicuous. The primary currency used in the camp was God crystal fragments. Meanwhile, not only could one find fragmented legendary items sold in every shop in the camp, but one could also find the incredibly 99 absolute techniques being sold. Only, the price of these absolute techniques could range anywhere from 1,000 God crystal fragments to 10,000 God crystal fragments. Of all the techniques Shifeng saw being sold, the most expensive one would have to be Darkstar, the 5th-ranking absolute technique. Outside the Holy Realm, players couldn't learn this absolute technique unless they belonged to an apex power. However, in the Holy Realm, players could get one complete learning opportunity so long as they paid 10,000 God crystal fragments. Aside from items in God's domain, the camp's shops also sold precious potions in the greater world, such as the precious Stardew highly coveted by the various cities. One drop of Stardew only cost 5,000 God crystal fragments. Once players paid up, the seller would immediately have the Stardew delivered to their doorsteps via the God's Domain Association. The entire Saint Camp had essentially become a trading hub for the various realms. The opportunities available here were far beyond what was available outside the Holy Realm. So long as one had God crystal fragments, the Holy Realm would be no different than paradise. With all the opportunities available here, even if players could leave the Holy Realm, they wouldn't necessarily choose to leave. In fact, that was indeed the case for some experts. Despite having the ability to leave the Holy Realm at any time, some experts would voluntarily choose to remain. Some of these experts had even developed their own forces in the Holy Realm to make a fortune in the real world. In the evening, after touring the entire Saint Camp, Shifeng made an appointment to explore the depths of the dilapidated city with the trio tomorrow. Then, with the trio's help, he rented a room in an inconspicuous hotel for the exorbitant price of 1 God crystal fragment per night. With the prices the Saint Camp's hotels charged, operating a hotel was even more lucrative than robbing players. After entering his room, Shifeng didn't have anything better to do, so he decided to take a closer look at the tattered leather pouch Ghost Hand dropped. TL notes: just to recap, the Luminous Glory list only records players under 35 years old. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3339, Chapter 413, Book of Eternity. Chapter 3339, Chapter 413, Book of Eternity. Chapter 413, Book of Eternity. When Shifeng used an identification skill on the tattered pouch, to his surprise, he found that not only did his identification skill fail, but eternal energy even started to slowly spread from the pouch. What dense eternal energy! Shifeng was shocked by the eternal energy overflowing from the pouch. The density of the eternal energy coming out of the pouch was even more exaggerated than the eternal energy found on the 100 Refinement Building's second floor, which was already incredibly rare in the Greater God's domain. So, Shifeng couldn't even begin to imagine what was stored inside the pouch. However, when Shifeng tried to open the pouch to inspect its contents, several magic barriers suddenly appeared and sealed the pouch, preventing him from opening it. An eternal object. These were the words that Shifeng instinctively thought of after seeing all that had happened with the pouch. Eternal objects in God's domain were indestructible. At the same time, they could not be appraised. Even if something or someone managed to appraise an eternal object, all they would see was the word unknown in the item's description. When Shifeng combined the fact that the pouch was leaking unbelievably rich eternal energy and could not be appraised, the only thing he could think of was that the pouch was an eternal object. Where did that guy get this thing from? Shifeng's heart remained in an excited state as he looked at the tattered pouch enveloped by magic barriers. Almost all eternal objects were products of the era of ancient gods, and every one of them was incomparably precious. Their rarity also far exceeded legendary weapons. If Ghost Hand knew what he had dropped, he would probably have the urge to die right about now. However, Shifeng didn't think too much about how Ghost Hand had gotten his hands on an eternal object. Immediately, he began inspecting the barriers protecting the pouch. Eternal objects in God's domain could be put into two general categories: dead eternal objects that were damaged to an unusable extent and partially damaged eternal objects that retained a certain degree of their original abilities. If it was a dead eternal object, repairing it would be beyond difficult. Unless players could come across a special encounter, owning a dead eternal object would be no different than owning a piece of junk. If it was a partially damaged eternal object, then it would be worth a fortune. Currently, it was obvious that the tattered pouch belonged to the latter group, making it an eternal object that still retained a portion of its abilities. These barriers don't look like a problem. Any great Grandmaster magician could crack them, Shifeng concluded in pleasant surprise after inspecting the barriers for half an hour. Products of the ancient gods era typically remained in the blind spots of players. Only players who had an ancient god legacy could have a chance of obtaining these items. Yet, now, the barriers protecting the tattered pouch only required a great Grandmaster magician to undo. Such a requirement might seem impossibly high by modern-day standards, but it should be known that the status of great Grandmaster magicians during the era of ancient gods was lower than even that of master magicians in modern-day God's domain. After all, while craftsman magicians weren't everywhere back then, they still existed, which was infinitely more than the craftsman magicians that existed in the modern era. At least, as far as Shifeng knew, there were no living craftsman magicians in the current greater God's domain, their existence having become a myth at this point. Immediately, Shifeng started to work on breaking the barriers protecting the tattered pouch. 1 hour. 2 hours. 3 hours. Roughly 6 hours after Shifeng had started, the barriers protecting the pouch shattered simultaneously. Once the barriers were gone, the tattered pouch started to disintegrate, and dense eternal energy started to spread across the entire room. Shifeng was a little confused when he saw the pouch disintegrating. After all, this was an eternal object they were talking about. An eternal object. This was an item that not even ancient gods could destroy. Yet, now, an eternal object had disintegrated right before his very eyes. Before Shifeng could start cursing his luck, the ashes of the tattered pouch suddenly transformed into a tablet half the size of his palm. This is a book of eternity. When Shifeng saw the tablet made entirely out of red obsidian before him, his mind fell into a daze. For the average player, they might not have even heard of the Books of Eternity before. However, the Books of Eternity were something known by every conglomerate and apex power in the greater God's domain, and they were items that could make even apex powers go crazy for it. This was because the Books of Eternity contained a record of knowledge passed down from the era of ancient gods. To the confusion of players, there were several missing eras in God's domain's history. Or more specifically, there were no historical records of these eras, and people could only infer and research their existences based on the items left over from these eras. It was also because of these missing eras that despite modern-day technology making continuous progress, it still couldn't beat the era of myriad gods, let alone the era of ancient gods. An example of the inferiority of modern-day technology would be the inability of modern people of God's domain to repair sacred armor. However, the Books of Eternity contained knowledge from the era of ancient gods. To Shifeng's knowledge, a total of 4 Books of Eternity had appeared in the greater God's domain thus far. Meanwhile, these 4 Books of Eternity had created 4 transcendental powers in the greater God's domain, and one of these 4 powers was the 7 Luminaries Alliance. According to rumors, the 7 Luminaries Alliance had gone from being an insignificant power to becoming an apex power in only several decades thanks to the Book of Eternity it found. Then, over time, it eventually became one of the oldest powers in the current greater God's domain. Although nobody knew what knowledge the 7 Luminaries Alliance acquired from its Book of Eternity, nobody ever doubted the Alliance's strength. Even Demon Gate, an apex power with a divine set under its ownership, dared not make enemies with the Seven Luminaries Alliance. Meanwhile, out of all the powers that dared to make enemies with the Seven Luminaries Alliance, every one of them was annihilated. Even apex powers were not an exception. In fact, the Seven Luminaries Alliance was so powerful that many powers wondered why the Alliance had not used its strength to dominate the entire Greater God's domain. Instead, the Alliance settled with only collecting various geniuses and doing business across the various realms. As for the three other transcendental powers that had acquired a Book of Eternity, they were no longer heard of in the current Greater God's domain. Even so, it was rumored that all three of these powers still existed. It was just that they were no longer present in the various realms. Meanwhile, Shifeng had now gotten his hands on the fifth Book of Eternity, the fifth transcendental power, her? Shifeng couldn't help but grow excited as he looked at the red obsidian tablet in the palm of his hand. Immediately, he clicked on it to inspect it. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3340, Chapter 414, Mythological Class. Chapter 3340, Chapter 414, Mythological Class. Chapter 414, Mythological Class. The room was quiet as Shifeng carefully tapped his finger on the tablet. Immediately afterward, lines of information appeared before Shifeng one after another. Book of Eternity, Eternal Object. This Book of Eternity records forbidden knowledge written by the last great sage Ansel. You must first become a divine engraver to access this forbidden knowledge. You may spend one god crystal to activate the divine engraver legacy once. Indestructible. The divine engraver legacy? Shifeng was shocked when he saw the Book of Eternity's item description. Although he had long known that Books of Eternity were extraordinary, he didn't think they could be this incredible. The divine engraver subclass was one of the long-lost hidden subclasses in God's domain, and it vanished from God's domain at the end of the era of mythology. It was also known as a mythological class by players in the current God's domain. It should be known that various items in God's domain were composed of divine patterns. Meanwhile, these items possessed far superior capabilities to their modern counterparts. In fact, many weapons and equipment left over from the era of mythology were engraved with divine patterns, and these weapons and equipment could display incredible power. Unfortunately, no legacies for the divine engraver subclass had ever been found. Despite all the effort the Greater God's domain's various powers had put into researching the subclass, the most players could do thus far was engrave some fragmented and rudimentary divine patterns. However, even if a player only knew how to engrave half-baked divine patterns, they would still be highly valued and respected by the various conglomerates and apex powers. The influence they could enjoy would also be dozens of times greater than forgers and alchemists. In fact, these divine engravers were so highly sought after that there was a past instance where two apex powers had devastated an entire realm for the sake of one. In the end, only after the Seven Luminaries Alliance had stepped forward to mediate the situation did the two apex powers cease their actions. It should be known that these so-called divine engravers hadn't truly learned the art of engraving divine patterns. They only learned how to draw fragmented and rudimentary divine patterns via bits and pieces of knowledge from ancient god legacies. Even so, they already enjoyed such incredible influence in the Greater God's domain. Yet, now, the Book of Eternity before Shifeng recorded a complete divine engraver legacy. If news of this got out, it would absolutely shake the entire Greater God's domain. It might even cause all apex powers to act. After all, divine engravers had the technique to strengthen all objects. So long as they could possess such a technique, becoming the second Seven Luminaries Alliance wouldn't be a dream. No wonder the Books of Eternity can create transcendental powers in the Greater God's domain, Shifeng thought as he looked at the tablet in his palm. But the cost of one god crystal per learning opportunity. The rarity of god crystals was no less than that of fragmented legendary items. In addition, many fragmented legendary items required god crystals to repair. Yet, there was no stable source of god crystals in God's domain. If Shifeng had to name a place that players could get god crystals from somewhat reliably in the Greater God's domain, It would have to be the various divine ruins found in the endless void. However, these divine ruins were occupied by the various upper-ranking hegemonic powers and apex powers. Ordinary players couldn't even get near them, let alone hunt for god crystals in them. Meanwhile, players weren't guaranteed to become a divine engraver on their first attempt at inheriting the legacy. There were two reasons the divine engraver subclass was regarded as a mythological class. Firstly, it was because there were no known legacies available for the subclass. Players couldn't learn how to become a divine engraver even if they wanted to become one. Secondly, it was because of the divine engraver subclass's uniqueness. It wasn't like other subclasses that could be gained simply by paying money to an NPC instructor and learning some basic knowledge. Instead, the divine engraver subclass was similar to the magician subclass, where players could only become a magician after drawing a complete magic array. In the divine engraver subclass's case, players could only become one after successfully engraving a complete divine pattern. Meanwhile, the difficulty of engraving divine patterns was much greater than drawing magic arrays. From an outsider's perspective, when a divine engraver was engraving a divine pattern onto an object, it would only seem like the divine engraver was engraving a bunch of incomprehensible patterns on the object. However, in reality, the divine engraver was restructuring the object itself to achieve the desired effects. The difficulty of such a feat went without saying, and it wasn't a process players could learn how to do after watching only one or two demonstrations. Thinking up to this point, Shafong gritted his teeth and took a god crystal out of his bag. Then, he chose to start inheriting the divine engraver legacy. While the cost of learning to become a divine engraver was high, so long as he succeeded, he could easily recoup his investment and more. Once the god crystal in Shafong's hand disappeared, the red obsidian tablet in his other hand glowed. Then, images and information began flooding Shafong's mind. In less than 10 minutes, all basic information on the divine engraver subclass was crammed into Shafong's mind, and Shafong couldn't help but be amazed by what he had just learned. As expected of a proper legacy, it actually goes into such detail on divine patterns. It's definitely worth the god crystal I paid. Shafong was in awe as he looked at the Book of Eternity. Although he had only learned one set of basic divine patterns, which was the basic strengthening pattern, it was still drastically superior to the various divine patterns he had collected during his previous life. During his previous life, the divine patterns he collected were all fragments. Even when he engraved them onto items, the divine patterns only strengthened the item's basic attributes by no more than 5%. However, the basic strengthening pattern could increase the basic attributes of fragmented legendary items and below by 10%. A 10% increase in basic attributes might not seem like much, but it would be no different than increasing the quality of one's weapons and equipment by half a rank. The basic strengthening pattern could let dark gold items have basic attributes close to rivaling epic items, and epic items have basic attributes close to rivaling fragmented legendary items. This was a significant improvement. Fragmented legendary items were hard to come by, even for apex powers, not only because monsters rarely dropped them but also because there were very few players who could manufacture them. This situation led to epic items dominating the market. Yet, now, the basic strengthening pattern could let epic items have basic attributes close to rivaling fragmented legendary items and increase the basic attributes of players by half a rank. If this improvement was extended to all players in a power, the increase in said power's overall strength would be noteworthy. Immediately, Shafong took out Blasphemer, which had fallen into disuse, from his bag along with a piece of 7 luminaries crystal. Then, he began engraving the basic strengthening pattern on Blasphemer using the crystal. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3341, Chapter 415 Extrasensory. Chapter 3341, Chapter 415 Extrasensory. Chapter 415 Extrasensory. TL Notes. Era of Mythology - Mythical Era Mythological Class - Mythical Class. The basic strengthening pattern was composed of 3 different divine patterns: the basic structural analysis pattern, the basic structural remodeling pattern, and the basic structural solidification pattern. These 3 patterns were the basics of basics among divine patterns, and only after grasping these 3 basic patterns could one be considered a basic apprentice divine engraver. Shifeng had done plenty of research into divine patterns during his previous life and even experienced engraving divine patterns. So, he wasn't a stranger to engraving divine patterns. In only a moment, Shifeng smelted the 7 luminaries crystal needed to engrave the divine pattern into incomparably rich mana. Then, he poured this mana directly onto blasphemer. The reason divine patterns were given the divine label was that gods were the first existences to use them. Gods possessed mana far beyond the reach of the human race. No matter how powerful a mana body a human managed to create, they still couldn't gain mana rivaling gods. This remained true even after humans reached Tier 6. The main reason was that the mana of gods was of a higher purity than even the mana contained in 7 luminaries crystals. And since one needed mana rivaling the gods to engrave divine patterns, humans couldn't use their own mana to engrave divine patterns. Instead, they needed to find alternative sources of mana. Meanwhile, 7 luminaries crystals were one of the main alternative sources humans used to engrave divine patterns. The only problem with this solution was that engraving divine patterns consumed a lot of mana. By the time Shifeng finished engraving the 3 divine patterns, he had expended a total of 70 units of 7 luminaries crystal, with the basic structural analysis pattern costing 10 units, the basic structural remodeling pattern costing 20 units, and the basic structural solidification pattern costing 40 units. The mana cost doubled with every divine pattern he tried to add to blasphemer. This was an exorbitant mana cost, and it was only made worse by the fact that he wasn't guaranteed success when engraving divine patterns, as evidenced by how he had met with failure when he tried to engrave the basic structural solidification pattern. According to historical records, this ridiculous cost was also why, even during the era of mythology, few people had become divine engravers. Without sufficient financial strength and resources, it was simply impossible for one to become a divine engraver. After his failed attempt, Shifeng continued trying to engrave the basic strengthening pattern. Before an hour passed, Shifeng had already failed 20 attempts. And as he would always fail on the final step, which was the basic structural solidification pattern, he had lost a total of 1,400 units of 7 luminaries crystal thus far. Even hegemonic powers would flinch at this price. After all, this was only the cost of enhancing one weapon by 10% of its basic attributes. Moreover, he hadn't even succeeded in enhancing blasphemer yet. Thankfully, I have the 7 luminaries crystals I got from Dira. Otherwise, there's no way I can afford to become a divine engraver with only one primal or vein. Shifeng wryly smiled as he looked at the remains of the 7 luminaries crystals he had expended on the ground. The average hegemonic power in the greater gods' domain only earned several thousand units of 7 luminaries crystal per day. It wouldn't take Shifeng more than a few hours to spend them all. Meanwhile, this was before Shifeng had even become an apprentice divine engraver. Once he officially became an apprentice divine engraver or even a divine engraver, the rate at which he expended 7 luminaries crystal would most likely go beyond the ability of hegemonic powers to support. But why am I still failing at structural solidification? I've even re-watched the demonstration and made sure every step I take is correct. Shifeng was confused as he looked at the long sword in his hand. Could there be something wrong with my structural analysis and remodeling? Shifeng was not new to drawing and engraving divine patterns. On the contrary, he was quite confident in engraving basic divine patterns. Otherwise, he wouldn't have decided to become a divine engraver, even if he did have a complete legacy for the subclass. After all, the cost of becoming a divine engraver wasn't something he could just shrug off. Yet, he had failed 20 times in a row. The success rate he faced now was even lower than what he had to deal with during his previous life. Should I use another one? Thinking up to this point, Shifeng couldn't help but wonder if he should watch the Divine Engraver Legacy's foundational demonstrations again. God crystals were currently one of his trump cards. Previously, he had already expended several God crystals to fight against the Paimon conglomerate's army. Later on, he expended some more God crystals to repair the Abyss Workshop certification. After deducting the 2 God crystals he had spent on inheriting the Divine Engraver Legacy, He only had 20 god crystals remaining. God crystals were not easy to come by, so every time he inherited the Divine Engraver legacy would be one less trump card available for him. Rather than having more trump cards, becoming a Divine Engraver is a greater priority right now. After considering the matter, Shifeng ultimately decided to expend one more god crystal. Having the strength to combat Tier 6 players might be important, but its significance paled compared to becoming a Divine Engraver. After all, even if he could fight against Tier 6 players, he was still only one person. However, if he became a bona fide Divine Engraver, he would have the ability to create a group of Tier 6 combatants. Subsequently, the Book of Eternity glowed, and the Divine Engraver Legacy's foundational information flooded Shifeng's mind once more. This time, Shifeng did not try to process all of the demonstrations shown to him. Instead, he focused solely on the demonstration of structural analysis. He carefully watched how the demonstrator conducted structural analysis, taking note of even the mana fluctuations. Shifeng had engraved many divine patterns during his previous life. Although he had encountered many failures, he also had some successes, which meant that there shouldn't be any major problems with his structural solidification. In that case, something must have gone wrong in his structural analysis or remodeling. He had only been making exact copies of divine patterns he had found during his previous life. He had succeeded without ever doing any structural analysis. So, it didn't make sense he would fail to succeed after executing a complete structural analysis. The demonstration was brief, but when Shifeng focused, no secrets could hide from his Tier 6 concentrations detection. Sure enough, something is wrong with my structural analysis. The analysis method shown in the demonstration was ingenious. The demonstrator did not use mana to conduct the analysis. Instead, the demonstrator used their mental perception, which allowed the demonstrator to avoid influencing the structural operation with mana. Previously, Shifeng had subjectively used the 7 luminaries crystals mana to conduct structural analysis. However, the demonstrator used the 7 luminaries crystals mana only to engrave the basic structural analysis pattern. Then, the demonstrator relied on the divine pattern to strengthen their mental perception's analysis of the target item's mana structure. After verifying that his previous failures were his own fault, Shifeng started using his mental perception to analyze Blasphemer's mana structure. First attempt. Second attempt. Third attempt. Shifeng made numerous attempts to accomplish mental perception through the divine pattern he drew. Although he was met with consecutive failures, each failed attempt increased his proficiency. After spending 8 hours and several tens of thousands of units of 7 luminaries crystal, Shifeng could conduct structural analysis almost instinctively. He could almost instantly understand the mana structure and operation of items. Meanwhile, after analyzing Blasphemer's mana structure, Shifeng remodeled it before solidifying it. Then, as soon as he finished doing so, a complete set of divine patterns appeared on Blasphemer. Did I achieve extrasensory? Shifeng couldn't help but doubt himself as he looked at the long sword in his hand. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3342, Chapter 416, The Last Sword Saint. Chapter 3342, Chapter 416, The Last Sword Saint. Chapter 416, The Last Sword Saint. TL Notes. Fixed an error in Chapter 414 original. However, the basic strengthening pattern could increase the basic attributes of fragmented legendary items and below by 10%. Edited, however, the basic strengthening pattern could increase the basic attributes of items beneath the fragmented legendary rank by 10%. The extrasensory realm. This was a hurdle that countless geniuses and paragons in the greater god's domain could never cross. It was also typically known as the beyond domain realm by most people. Upon reaching the extrasensory realm, players would no longer be limited to simply perceiving everything around them. Instead, they could also use everything around them to their own benefit. They could even foresee the future to some extent. I did it. Just like that. At this time, Shifeng was in disbelief as he looked at everything around him. It felt as if he had just opened the door to a new world. During his previous life, Shifeng was always stuck at the third step of the domain realm, and it was only by virtue of his fortuitous encounters and special tools that he could traverse the greater god's domain without worry. He was a lot worse than experts who relied solely on their combat standards to reach the greater god's domain's apex. However, because of the divine engraver subclass, he had finally crossed that threshold and entered a whole new realm. Now that he had reached the extrasensory realm, he had a firm grasp of all the movements around him and could also picture the flow of mana in the room with perfect clarity. Thanks to this detailed knowledge, he could predict even the trajectories of the bugs flying in the room. With a flick of his finger, Shifeng struck down a flying bug with an air bullet. From a third person's perspective, it looked like the bug had taken the initiative to fly toward the air bullet. Moreover, after the air bullet struck the bug, said bug struck another flying bug trying to avoid it, and this situation repeated one time after another. In the blink of an eye, the dozen or so bugs flying in the room collided and fell to the floor. So, this is the extrasensory realm? No wonder I could never reach it in the past. Shifeng couldn't help but smile as he looked at the dazed bugs on the floor. If, before he reached the extrasensory realm, his perception of the world was described to be limited to 2 dimensions, his perception had now expanded to include a third dimension. This allowed him to do combat using 3 dimensions instead of just 2, which drastically increased the possibilities he could accomplish in battle. Before Shifeng could conduct further research on the extrasensory realm, he suddenly received a call. "Good news, Brother Black Flame," Desolate Fury excitedly said through the video call. "La Roja found us a great deal. So long as we can complete this next commission, we'll have enough fragments to exchange a return talisman." "That generous?" Shifeng was a little surprised by the news. After learning a bit about the Holy Realm situation, Shifeng already knew that God crystal fragments were very hard to come by. Even players as strong as Cross and La Roja couldn't earn more than 10 fragments a day through raiding party dungeons. Meanwhile, although commissions were a much more lucrative source of God crystal fragments, players would already be very lucky if they could earn 10 fragments per commission. It should be known that saint camps were established by players. So, all commissions found in a saint camp came from players rather than NPCs, and there was no way players would be as generous as NPCs. Yet, according to Desolate Fury, the commission La Roja found could let each of them earn enough fragments to purchase a return talisman. In other words, each of them stood to earn at least 100 God crystal fragments. Very few people in the saint camp could afford to pay such a lucrative reward for a single commission. "Anyway, just come. If we're late, someone else might snatch it away," Desolate Fury said before hurriedly disconnecting the call and sending Shifeng the meeting point's coordinates. When Shifeng looked out the window, he saw that the sky outside had already started to brighten. Before he realized it, a night had gone by. Immediately, Shifeng put the Book of Eternity into his bag and left for the meeting point. Although Shifeng had already become a basic apprentice divine engraver, it still wasn't enough for him to make a living in the Holy Realm. A basic apprentice divine engraver could only learn basic divine patterns whose effects were limited to epic items and below. When Shifeng walked down the Saint Camp streets in the early morning, he saw that even the players sleeping on the street were equipped with several fragmented legendary items. So, it was no exaggeration to say that epic items were useless to the Holy Realms players. Meanwhile, if Shifeng wished to strengthen fragmented legendary weapons and equipment, he would have to become an official divine engraver, according to the Book of Eternity. However, to become a divine engraver, he would need to learn how to engrave a set of intermediate divine patterns, and exchanging for a set of intermediate divine patterns from the Book of Eternity would cost him at least 50 God crystals. God crystals were incredibly rare, even in the Holy Realm. Typically, God crystals would only drop as loot in 20-man team dungeons or above. So, players operating solo or in parties shouldn't think of getting their hands on God crystals. Moreover, even when player teams got their hands on a God crystal, they would never choose to sell it. God crystals could be used to repair fragmented legendary items. Even if some fragmented legendary items would not reach the legendary rank after getting repaired, a complete fragmented legendary item would still be much stronger than an incomplete one. Hence, Most people who got their hands on god crystals would usually use their god crystals to strengthen themselves instead of selling them for a profit. Fortunately, Shifeng had the 7 Luminaries Codex. Even if he wasn't a great Grandmaster alchemist, he could still convert 100 god crystal fragments into 1 god crystal using omni-refinement. Hence, if Shifeng wanted to learn a set of intermediate divine patterns from the Book of Eternity, all he needed to do was collect enough god crystal fragments. After walking along the Saint Camp's main street for roughly 20 minutes, Shifeng arrived at the coordinates Desolate Fury sent him, and it would seem that the meeting took place in an underground ruin. The entire Saint Camp was built atop the ruins of a city. Although players had continuously modified the camp, the underground ruins remained mostly untouched. Many of these underground ruins had even become private gathering spots for the various powers. The underground ruin Shifeng arrived in was the size of roughly 3 basketball courts. The ruin was enveloped by a magic barrier that prevented those on the outside from seeing and hearing whatever was taking place inside, while providing those on the inside an unobstructed view of the outside. At this time, several dozen players were already gathered in this underground ruin. All of these players were at level 139 or above, and many were experts fully clad in fragmented legendary items. Many of these experts were comparable to the likes of Cross and LaRoja in terms of combat standards, and over a dozen experts were clearly superior to Cross and LaRoja. Theft is never good, try looking at me. You're finally here, Brother Black Flame. When Desolate Fury saw Shifeng stepping into the barrier, he pointed at one of the 2 people talking to LaRoja and said, "Let me introduce you. This man here is Amber Soul, an acquaintance of LaRoja. It is all thanks to Brother Amber that we are even qualified to take on the commission this time." Hearing Desolate Fury introducing him, the young man speaking to LaRoja shyly nodded at Shifeng. Amber Soul? When Shifeng saw the young man's face, memories from his previous life promptly surfaced in his mind. Amber Soul, the last sword saint acknowledged by the 7 Luminaries Alliance. Typically, the 7 Luminaries Alliance would add a prefix when awarding sword saint titles to players. A few examples would be the Silver Sword Saint, the Heavenly Sword Saint, etc. However, the title Amber Soul received was just a plain and simple sword saint. Before Amber Soul came around, the Sword Saint title was also one that the 7 Luminaries Alliance had not granted to anybody for several eras. Meanwhile, it was extraordinarily difficult for a swordsman to receive the Sword Saint title from the Alliance. This was because the condition to obtain it was for a Tier 5 swordsman to slay a Tier 6 god. Before Amber Soul came about, it had already been several centuries since anybody had accomplished this feat. Unfortunately, just when everyone thought Amber Soul would reach Tier 6 and stir up an entire era, he suddenly vanished. Then, following his disappearance, Amber Soul became revered as the last sword saint of the era. While Shifeng was recalling Amber Soul's legacy, the young female swordsman standing next to Amber Soul suddenly looked at Shifeng and said, "Black Flame, is it? So, you're the guy who Big Sis LaRoja mentioned? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible." Chapter 3343, Chapter 417, Contention between Swordsmen. Chapter 3343, Chapter 417, Contention between Swordsmen. Chapter 417, Contention between swordsmen. The young female swordsman was clad in an 8-piece fragmented legendary equipment set. By the looks of the set, it also seemed customized to fit the wearer. Aside from the fragmented legendary equipment set, there was a crystalline longsword with a blade as thin as a cicada's wing hanging by the girl's waist, the weapon emitting a glow unique to legendary weapons. Combined with her delicate figure and stunning appearance that overshadowed even LaRoja, the girl instantly became the center of attention in the room as soon as she spoke. Although the words that came out of the female swordsman's mouth were words of inquiry, her tone carried hints of arrogance that displeased LaRoja a little. However, despite her displeasure, LaRoja dared not say anything about it. This was because the female swordsman was not only extraordinary in strength but also in origins. Find the original at me. The Little Princess of the Platinum Realm's Dragon Tongue Conglomerate, Cheng Xin. The Platinum Realm was comparable to the Dragon Mountain Realm, and the Dragon Tongue conglomerate was existence on par with the Galaxy conglomerate. Hence, even in the Holy Realm, few people dared to offend Cheng Xin. Cheng Xin. When Amber Soul heard the little princess's rude tone, he said, "You are behaving rudely to Big Sis Laroja's friend." Upon getting reprimanded by Amber Soul, Cheng Xin stuck out her tongue and said, "It's just that I find him strange." Pausing, Cheng Xin took a moment to scrutinize Shifeng's inconspicuous appearance before continuing, "I've met many geniuses on the luminous glory list, but none look like him. I can't feel any aura from him, and his movements show that he hasn't reached the 5th floor standard yet. Even his equipment is merely a damaged, fragmented, legendary-ranked sacred armor. Can you blame me for doubting him if he looks like this? No matter how I look at him, he doesn't look like he can defeat Ghost Hand. The commission this time is of utmost importance. What if we fail because of his lack of strength?" Upon hearing Cheng Xin's evaluation, the many experts present also looked at Shifeng with curiosity and confusion. Everyone present had heard of the name of Black Flame. After all, that was a luminous glory expert they were talking about. Not to mention, it was rumored that Black Flame was responsible for killing the Dragon Mountain Realm's Ghost Hand previously. However, it was just as Cheng Xin said. Even though they had met with quite a few luminous glory experts before, none looked as inconspicuous as Shifeng. In addition, Shifeng wasn't even at the 5th floor standard. So, they found it hard to imagine someone like Shifeng could enter the luminous glory list and defeat a 5th floor expert like Ghost Hand. "I can assure you that guild leader Black Flame has defeated Ghost Hand, Miss Cheng Xin. I was there at the time," Laroja said with some apprehension. Laroja wasn't familiar with Cheng Xin. She was only acquaintances with Amber Soul. It was also thanks to her connection with Amber Soul that she and her party could be invited to this commission. However, the final decision on whether her party could actually join the commission still depended on Cheng Xin, who was related to the commission's client. "I trust Big Sis Laroja's words, Cheng Xin," Amber Soul said. "Brother Black Flame is a luminous glory expert who has gained the 7 Luminaries Alliance's acknowledgement. He is definitely qualified for the commission. Even if everything about him is true, he is only ranked 963rd on the luminous glory list. He is a far cry compared to you, Big Brother Amber," Cheng Xin said as she looked at Amber Soul in worship. "But out of respect for you, I will talk to the client about him, Big Brother Amber." "Don't get angry, Brother Black Flame," Desolate Fury quietly whispered to Shifeng. "That girl is the young lady of the Platinum Realm's Dragon Tongue conglomerate. We'll most likely have to suffer if we upset her." Shifeng didn't say anything regarding Cheng Xin's comments. He was also aware of Cheng Xin's identity as she was considerably famous in the Greater God's domain. In addition to being the Dragon Tongue conglomerate's little princess, Cheng Xin was also a peerless paragon, having become a 3-star mental strength grandmaster at a young age. During Shifeng's previous life, Cheng Xin had even killed a Tier 6 god as a Tier 6 player. Although the current Cheng Xin was at Tier 4, she was already a 5th floor expert. More importantly, she ranked 326th on the Luminous Glory list. In front of her, a 5th floor expert like Ghost Hand wouldn't last more than a few moves. So, Shifeng found it understandable that Cheng Xin would look down on someone ranked in the 900s. It didn't help that Amber Soul, someone ranked in the Luminous Glory list's top 300, was present to serve as a comparison. Shortly after Shifeng arrived, a group of 3 people entered the underground ruin. Of these 3 people, one was an elegant, middle-aged man, one was a burly young man, and one was an old man carrying a bow and arrows. As soon as these 3 people appeared, everyone felt a strong pressure bearing down on them. "You stubborn little girl. I already told you not to come, so why wouldn't you listen?" the elegant, middle-aged man asked as he glared at Cheng Xin. "The operation this time is of utmost importance. This isn't a place where you youngsters should come to play." Disgruntled by the middle-aged man's words, Cheng Xin said, "Who said I came here to play? I brought Big Brother Amber with me. We won't have any trouble stopping the Dragon Mountain Realm's younger generation." Cheng Xin dared not behave arrogantly in front of the elegant, middle-aged man. This was because the other party was flint, an expert who used to rank among the Luminous Glory List's top 100 roughly 3 decades ago. At the same time, he was also one of the Dragon Tongue conglomerate's directors. As for the burly young man and bow-carrying old man, they were elders of the Dragon Tongue conglomerate. Both used to rank among the Luminous Glory List's top 500 during their younger days. With their current strength, they could easily beat up youngsters like her. Suit yourself, but be sure to run if you can't beat them, Flint said as he looked at Cheng Xin helplessly. I know. Cheng Xin smiled and nodded. Afterward, Flint walked up to the elevated platform in the underground ruin and swept his gaze across everyone in the room. Then, he said, I am Flint, the client of the commission. All of you here are our camp's top-ranking experts. I don't need you all to do much, you just need to stop the mercenaries hired by the Dragon Mountain Realm's Heavenly God Corporation. Those mercenaries won't number more than 50. You can keep the loot of your kills, but I need you to stall them for 10 minutes. So long as you can do that, everyone will receive 100 God Crystal Fragments. There will also be a bonus for those who have made significant contributions. However, I also have to clarify that should you fail to stall them for 10 minutes, you won't receive any payment. Nobody present said anything about Flint's warning. This was usually how sketchy private commissions worked. Although such commissions didn't have any minimum payout, the returns for success were extremely high. The payout for one such commission could make up for several days' worth of normal commissions. After Flint made sure that nobody present had a problem, he used an advanced teleportation crystal to teleport everyone to the middle of a ruined city. Then, he activated a Tier 5 isolation scroll to put everyone under stealth. After doing all of that, he had everyone hide in the surrounding buildings as they waited for their target to arrive. Roughly 20 minutes later, a caravan guarded by a 50-man team slowly made its way down the street flanked by Flint's team. Target has appeared. Get ready. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3344, Chapter 418, Still Not the Strongest. Chapter 3344, Chapter 418, Still Not the Strongest. Chapter 418, Still Not the Strongest. When Shifeng saw that the Dragon Mountain Realms players were indeed escorting the approaching caravan, a smile appeared on his face. There were 50 players in the caravan, and everyone was equipped with a fragmented legendary equipment set. Some of these players were even equipped with legendary equipment, and one such player was Ghost Hand. At this time, Ghost Hand was still at level 140. It hadn't been more than a day since Shifeng killed him, so it was obvious that Ghost Hand had indeed negated the death penalty with a substitution tool. Can you four take care of Ghost Hand and the 3 people next to him? Cheng Xin quietly asked Shifeng after looking at the approaching caravan. If not for Amber Soul, Cheng Xin would have never agreed to let Shifeng's group of 4 participate in the commission this time. It wouldn't have mattered that Shifeng ranked 963rd on the Luminous Glory list. Experts on the Luminous Glory list could indeed be considered apex existences of their respective realms. However, it was a different story in the Holy Realm. While 5th floor experts weren't everywhere, there was still a significant number in the various saint camps. It was especially so for older generation 5th floor experts. If not for their age, these veteran 5th floor experts would have long occupied the entire Luminous Glory list, and most, if not all, of the rookie 5th floor experts would be pushed out of the list. No problem, Shifeng nonchalantly responded. Just keep them busy for 10 minutes. Me and Big Brother Amber will take care of the older generation experts, so make sure Ghost Hand doesn't interrupt us, Cheng Xin said, displeased by Shifeng's behavior. If they interrupt us, none of you should think of getting paid. Don't worry. Ghost Hand's group won't get anywhere near you, Shifeng affirmed. Keep on boasting. Let's see how you'll beg for my help later. Cheng Xin smirked when she heard Shifeng's confident reply. The 3 players walking next to Ghost Hand were at the pseudo-5th floor standard. While Laroja, Cross, and Desolate Fury might be powerful experts, they were still a ways off from matching pseudo-5th floor experts. So, Shifeng would essentially have to go against 1 5th floor expert and 3 pseudo-5th floor experts by himself. Shortly after Cheng Xin finished speaking, the caravan moved within 300 yards of the team. Attack! Flint shouted through the team chat. Although the Tier 5 isolation scroll could put up to 50 people under stealth, the effects of stealth would only work against 5th floor experts up to a certain distance. Within 300 yards, stealth would become useless against a 5th floor expert. So, if they wanted to launch a sneak attack, the best time would be immediately after the caravan entered within 300 yards of them. Immediately, everyone on Flint's team left their hiding spots and charged at the caravan, their speed catching the caravan's titled experts off guard. Only the caravan's 5th floor experts and pseudo-5th floor experts managed to react to the ambush right away. These suicidal bastards. Kill them. Of the 50 players on the Heavenly God Corporation's team, over 30 reacted to the ambush, promptly charging at the ambushing team's 5th floor experts and pseudo-5th floor experts and ignoring the titled experts. As both sides were even on numbers, the 5th floor experts and pseudo-5th floor experts of both teams chose to fight on their own, and those who were extras targeted the titled experts. In the blink of an eye, numerous independent battles took place all over the street. There were 2 reasons these experts had chosen to fight independently. Firstly, experts of their caliber would rarely fight coordinated battles. Secondly, even if they fought in coordination, they would still have difficulty achieving a swift victory against opponents of the same combat standards. All they'd be doing was wasting time. So, rather than working together, it'd be more efficient if they targeted the opponent's weaker links before tackling the 5th floor experts together afterward. The Dragon Tongue Conglomerate's ambush team clearly outnumbered the Heavenly God Corporation's team when it came to 5th floor experts and pseudo-5th floor experts, with the Dragon Tongue Conglomerate's team having as many as 15 5th floor experts and 22 pseudo-5th floor experts. In comparison, although the Heavenly God Corporation's team had 24 pseudo-5th floor experts, it only had 12 5th floor experts. At the end of the day, 5th floor experts were stronger than pseudo-5th floor experts. One 5th floor expert could easily keep 3 pseudo-5th floor experts busy. Moreover, the pseudo-5th floor experts would be at high risk of getting killed if they weren't careful. Because of this difference, it didn't take long before the Heavenly God Corporation's team fell into a rough spot. "It's not too late to retreat now, old Kong," Flint excitedly said while waving his staff and bombarding a white-haired old man with countless fire blades. "Otherwise, once we have more hands on our side, none of you should think of escaping with your lives." The Heavenly God Corporation's team was far less prepared than they expected. The 2 extra 5th floor experts on their side were more than enough to give them an insurmountable advantage. In fact, the 2 extra 5th floor experts were already in the process of slaughtering the titled experts on the Heavenly God Corporation's team. "Do you think I've lived all these years in vain, Flint? Did you think I didn't expect you to ambush us?" the white-haired old man said, his expression remaining unfazed even when he saw the mercenaries he hired falling one after another. "You're the ones who are going to die here today." "You and what army?" Flint looked at the white-haired old man with disdain in his eyes. He and the white-haired old man were evenly matched in combat standards, and neither had ever won a fight against the other. They were also the highest authority of their respective organizations in the Holy Realm, so they were fully aware of the cards each other possessed. Now that the Dragon Tongue Conglomerates had 2 5th floor experts in excess, taking down the Heavenly God Corporation's team would be a piece of cake. In response to Flint's taunt, the white-haired old man suddenly smiled and said, "The illusory sea realm's hidden wind." Flint's expression instantly changed when he heard the white-haired old man's words. Then, with a look of horror, he shouted, "Retreat! Everyone retreat!" The Dragon Tongue Conglomerate's team members were confused by Flint's sudden call for retreat. It was especially so for Cheng Xin, who was busy fighting against a veteran 5th floor expert. After all, their team had an absolute advantage over the Heavenly God Corporation's team. It simply didn't make sense to retreat in this situation. However, before Cheng Xin and everyone else could make sense of Flint's command, a white-clad young man suddenly appeared above the street and quietly looked down on the battle beneath him. Hidden, wind. Cheng Xin's complexion instantly paled when she saw the young man in the sky. Hidden wind. The strongest player out of the illusory sea realm's younger generation. From a broad perspective, The illusory sea realm was evenly matched with the Dragon Mountain realm and the Platinum realm. However, Hidden Wind stood at a height that none of the younger paragons of the three realms could ever hope to reach. This was because Hidden Wind ranked 42nd on the Luminous Glory list. At the same time, he ranked among the top 10 of the Greater Gods Domain's younger generation swordsmen. Before Cheng Xin could react any further, Hidden Wind unsheathed a bladeless sword and swung it. Then, an extraordinary amount of mana fell on Cheng Xin, making her feel as if the sky was falling on her. At the same time, every fifth-floor expert on the battlefield felt a chill crawling down their back, their mind shouting that death was approaching. Crashing Moon. This was an exclusive absolute technique created by Hidden Wind via fusing two absolute techniques, and it was a gold combat technique that wasn't a gold combat technique. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,